Hello and welcome to a Blender tutorial on how to make Super Mario Sunshine custom maps. Now there's a lot of Blender tutorials out there, but I have seen a lot of people struggle with learning how to 3D model, and that can be sort of a hard thing to do, especially when there's nothing specifically catering to what you're trying to learn. So I figured I'd make something of my own with only the things that you'll need to know in order to make custom levels. So the first thing about 3D modeling is that a lot of people think that it's really extremely hard or something, but it's really not. Uh, it can be difficult at first, but once you learn all the functions and what everything does, then it's very easy because there's not really anything else to learn. You just have to use the things you know. So it can take a while. I'd describe it more as busy work than really anything super difficult. But it's actually a very easy thing to learn. So you might have to memorize some keyframes, or not keyframes, hotkeys. But once you're done with that, then it's pretty easy. So starting off here, this is what you'll be greeted with once you open Blender, and it's just the automatic default page with the cube. So first off, I'm gonna delete all these things and just have a blank plane here. So what you need to know is pretty much this create tab, and also you'll also need to know the tools tab. And that's pretty much the only two things that you need to know. I might cover some basic rendering or some basic animation, but that's really all you need to know for the main modeling of things. So first of all, you'll want to know how to move the camera around, and that is the middle mouse button. So hold the middle mouse button down and move your mouse, and it'll move around the camera. One thing that it's pretty easy to notice is that it's kind of hard to look at 3D things on a 2D screen, so your clicks might not always be super accurate. Like if I click over here, it's hard to tell at what depth that point is at. So it might be a bit tricky to figure out where you are at first, but you do get used to it after a while. So the camera controls are pretty simple. As I said, the middle mouse button is to look around. You can scroll the mouse button to go in and out, and there's also hotkeys to control the camera in certain ways, and those are your numbers on your number pad, or if you have a keyboard that doesn't have a number pad, you can also make it to where it's the numbers above your letters on your keyboard. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, things like that. So 1 goes into a flat sort of view going directly on the y-axis. 2, as you can see, it modifies the camera angle on the x-axis, rotating it around the x-axis. 3 goes looking directly into the x-axis. 4 rotates around the z-axis. 5 is orthographic view, which we'll get into later. 6 rotates around, I believe 6 rotates around wherever you're looking at the moment. 7 is top view. 8 rotates around X. And 9 is Y view again from the other side. So I've already talked a lot of hotkeys at you, and that is the hardest part of learning 3D modeling, is memorizing all the hotkeys. So one thing that I might suggest is to write down all the hotkeys, and that way when you're making stuff you can just look over at it, and once you do enough with the hotkeys it'll just become memorized naturally. You know, I think that's the easiest way to do it. You could just memorize it off the bat, but the camera directions are very useful. You might not have to use like all these hotkeys for something pretty simple. Like if you're making your first project, I would recommend to not just mess around with the camera hotkeys all the time, but they are very useful for reasons that I'll get into later in the video. Next is just moving things around, so very simple actions starting off. To move things around, it's G is the hotkey. You can also press translate over here, but it's much faster to do it with G. I've seen a lot of people that learn Blender and just use the manual buttons over here, but I can say that it's so much better to use hotkeys. I would honestly say it's worth the time memorizing them to be able to use them while you're working. It makes it much easier to think of things and not have to waste time with trying to remember what hotkey it is and lose what you were thinking about. So it is very useful to use hotkeys, and I would recommend them, but if you really want to, there are the manual buttons over here that you can press. So if I select this cube, I can press G and move it around. So that's another thing with the 3D scene, 2D screen. I can't really move this cube as freely as I would like. Like if I want to move it sort of in this corner here, I can't really do that as much as I try because it's really hard to get a 3D feel of a situation on a 2D screen. So if I just undo those, you can move things on the axis. So G is the hotkey, and then I can move that around, but if you also press the letter of the axis that you want to move it on, it will lock to that axis and you can move it back and forth on it. And so if I want to move it on the Y axis, I can do G, Y, and I can move it there, or the Z axis, G, Z, and that works too. Green is Y, red is X, and blue is Z. That's very easy to memorize once you get used to it. Another thing that you can also do if you want to easily drag things along an axis is click one of these arrows and just drag your mouse. I don't do this personally, I like to do it with the hotkeys, but I know a lot of people that use this function and it is pretty simple to use, especially if you're just starting out. So that is another option that you can do. But first, before I get into any of the more complex / advanced tools, I should go over objects, creation of primitives, and views of your scene. So those are some long words, but it's very much more simple than it sounds. So if you see this menu on the right here, this is your scene. As you can see, the heading is scene, and everything that you create in your scene will appear here. So this is my cube, and that's all I have in this scene, but if I create another cube, it'll be cube 01, and everything will be listed in here. You can drag around the menus up and down if you would like. It's kind of useful if you have a lot of objects. So all the menus are pretty free form. You can really do whatever you want with them. I like to drag this animation toolbar down because it's really not necessary for modeling. But the objects menu is directly related to your view. So down here is your view. As you can see, mine is currently object mode, and this is what you use to transition from moving objects in here to moving things within an object. So that's kind of difficult to understand. So let me just keep this cube here. So I'm editing in object mode now. So if all I can do now is do things that you can do with the entire object. I can't select something in the object to do it with. I can only move the entire object. So if I go into edit mode, you can click this and it opens this little menu here. If I go to edit mode, I can now move around specific parts of the object. So when you go up here and you create another cube, if you are in edit mode, this cube will be the same object as this cube. So if I go back into objects, this is the same, and I only have one cube here. But if I create a cube in object mode, it will create another object. And with this, I can move it around without affecting this object. So this is very useful if you're building something very complex. You can move, I don't know, a wall of your building without messing everything up, even if they are connected. So that's a very simple tool. I'll just start from a clean grid once more, and this menu in the object mode window is where you go to create all of your primitives, and everything in Blender is created from a primitive. You can manually create shapes, but it's extremely time consuming and difficult, so I really do everything from this primitives menu. There's not really anything you can't do. You can start with a simple cube and you can make this as complex and any shape that you want. If I did enough to this cube, it wouldn't even look like a cube anymore. I could make it mesh with tens of thousands of faces. So just because you're starting from one of these simple shapes doesn't mean that you're restricted by what that shape is. So for the purposes of example, I'll just keep two objects on my plane at all times just to get you used to switching around from object mode to edit mode and so on. So if I go into edit mode, it will only go into edit mode on the object that you've selected. You can select multiple objects at the same time and go into edit mode, but again, it only selects one object. So you can only be editing one object at any given time. So if I go into edit mode here, I can again move everything around within this object. I can select whatever I want, and that is how objects really work. And objects are the basis of everything that you will make in Blender. You don't have to do anything with the objects. I like to just have one object so I don't have to worry about which object am I on or what I'm editing. I only have one single object that my entire mesh is, so I don't have to worry about that. You can do that if you'd like, but objects is always something there that can help you out if you're doing something especially complex. So the primitives menu is really the maybe most useful menu in Blender. They also have the grid and the monkey. The grid is just a plane textured as a grid. I don't really use that at all. And the monkey is, to be honest, I don't know what this is. I'm pretty sure it's Blender's logo or their mascot or something, but this is pretty useful for demoing textures and materials. So again, I don't really use this very much. It's mainly just these top ones. So I'll get into lighting a little bit later once we start talking about materials and wrapping and rendering and all that, but for now we're just going to stick with the primitives. So I'll create a cube and I'll just bring that to the middle of my viewport, and I'll go into object mode, or I'm sorry, I'll go into edit mode, and we'll get into selecting things. So down here there are three buttons here, and they are vertex select, edge select, and face select. You'll use these quite a bit, and they're just what they sound like. Vertex select, you can select vertices. Edge select, you can select edges. And face select, you can select entire faces. So with vertex select, you can also select more than one vertex, and now you have an edge selected. So you don't necessarily have to be using a specific selection method in order to select what you want. And you can also press, or I'm sorry, you can hold shift while you click a vertex, and you can select more than one of it. So holding shift, click, click, and you can see what you have selected by the orange outline. Anything you don't have selected will remain black, like over here. And you can do the same thing with edge select and face select. So you can really select multiple things at any time, and that's very, very useful for doing or using some of the tools that I'm going to get into, because you can apply them to more than one thing at the same time, which saves a lot of time in modeling complex meshes. So now we're going to get into the tools here, and not all of these tools I'm going to go over. For example, bisect, screw, I don't really use those very much. Randomize, noise, pretty much all of the deform ones I don't really use very much, so you don't have to memorize all of these, but they are all definitely very useful. So the first one is extruding, but before we get to extruding, we have to again talk about moving. So we talked about moving things earlier, so if you have this whole cube and you can move it around with the G hotkey, but you can also move things around separately. So if I select this single face and I press G, I can move it around and nothing else will move with it. Only the things you have selected will move with it. So if I select an edge, I can move only that, and a vertex will do the same thing. So it's very important to know that moving things in object view and moving things in edit view are very different. So if I go back into object view, I can can't select anything within it, just the entire thing. But in edit view, I can select individual faces, edges, or vertices. So after moving, we're going to do extruding. So the hotkey for extruding is E, and if I press E on this face, you'll see that it does pretty much the same thing as moving, but it's slightly different. So what extruding does is it takes your face, and instead of moving it with the entire thing, it only moves the face and creates new faces to move with it. So the only thing that's going to be moving out of this existing cube is this one face. So if I press E and start extruding, I can move this around, but you'll see that none of the things that I started with are moving. It's only the things that I extruded that are moving. So if I go back and press E again, nothing else moves, and that is the very useful thing about extruding. So if I have a complex shape, I don't know, just mess around with this a little bit. So if I have something like this, I can move something without messing the entire thing up. So if I wanted to move this out, I could just extrude this out, where I couldn't really do that with just moving, because then you have stuff like this happening and your edges are getting all twisted up. So extruding is an extremely useful tool, and I use it almost all the time. So extruding again is the E hotkey, and it doesn't mess with anything that you previously have on screen. Extruding is especially useful if you have irregular faces. So just with this cube, that's about the most complex example I can do. But if I say add in a icosphere, just bring this to the middle. And if I start editing that, it's much more easy to see how extruding would help, since if I move this around, there's even more faces that get messed up and even less faces that get moved with extruding. So that is extruding in a nutshell. I'll come back to that once we're going into a bit more complex meshes, but that is the basics of extruding. The next tool we'll go over is subdivision. So subdivision is this button right here, but again, it doesn't really no matter what order you go in. So subdivision is pretty simple. It's exactly what it seems like. It just divides your face into equal parts. So it's very, very annoying if you have a face and you say want to split it into quarters. And if you wanted to do that, you have to manually place the points and keep track of all the coordinates everything's at to create perfectly straight lines. But with the subdivide tool, you can do that extremely easily. And with that, everything is a quarter. So it will not always do that with every single shape. It only does quarters if your shape is four-sided. So if I have triangles, it won't split them into squares. It'll split them into smaller, equally sized triangles. But since I have a cube here, subdivide does that. So that is the basic subdivide method. Next is scaling objects. Or I'm sorry, not objects, but really anything. So scaling works very simply. You just press S and you can scale it up and down however you want. But scaling is more useful than that because, again, you can lock actions to axes. So if I press S to scale and then I go Y, I can only scale it on the Y axis. And if you have a complex shape, it's very hard to get like rounded edges or something like that, and this is very useful for those types of things if you just want to make sort of a squat shaped cube. So without scaling, you would have to cut this entire cube into the dimensions you wanted it and create faces inside these faces, and you have to delete the remaining faces. But with scaling, you can make it larger or smaller very easily. So really any axis you want, Z, Y. It's again very useful for making objects that are similar to each other. So if you have a cube that you want to be the same shape as something else but a different size, that's very useful. Or say a wall that you want to go over a different length or area, you can use that tool. So I'll put my cube back here and we'll go to our next tool, which is inset faces. Inset faces is another useful one. Well, I guess they're all useful. I'm only going over the useful ones, but inset faces, the hotkey for that is I. So once you click I, you will see that there's a thin dotted line between my cursor and the center of this face. So if I pull this back and forth, you can see that inset faces creates a face inside this face. So that is what inset faces does, but the reason that it's so useful is that there's not really any other way to do that. Like if you try to do subdivide, I mean, I guess you could create a symmetrical shape with subdivide and just maybe do this or something. I guess that's the same shape, and you could do diagonal cuts into the corners, but inset faces makes it much more easy, which is basically all these tools are, is shortcuts on doing something complicated and making them easy. So you'll notice that if I press I and I'm now in the inset faces mode, you'll notice that on the bottom here, my mouse won't go off this middle screen, but on the bottom here you'll notice all of the functions that inset faces has. So I don't use many of the extra functions on inset faces, but I do on many of the other tools. So all of these functions you can play around with yourself. The major functions that are very useful I will mention, but it's also very easy to see down here what each one of them does and the hotkey for each one of them if you're forgetting. So I would recommend looking into those a bit, but for the purposes of this particular tutorial I won't get into them. Another thing with inset faces is how it works if you're selecting multiple faces. So now that I have, oops, I'm sorry, that's the wrong key. If I have multiple faces and I press inset, it will no longer do each individual face, it will do both faces together. So if I go even further down here, it will do all of my faces together, which is useful. And so on to our next tool, loop cut and slide. Loop cut and slide is it is a useful tool, but I don't use it as much as I do the others. It has very niche purposes, and I find that I can usually get by without it. But for preparedness, it is worth learning and checking out. So I believe the shortcut for it is Control R. So Control R is loop cut and slide. So when you press Control R, nothing will happen to your cursor. That's just what it does. But when you put your cursor near a mesh, you'll notice this purple line going through it. And this purple line perfectly bisects all of these faces. So this side of the face and this side of the face are completely equal, and the purple line is exactly on the midpoint of all of these edges. So if I click, the purple line goes away, and you're left with this orange sort of layer on your object. So after you click, you can move this layer up and down or side to side on the faces that you have selected with your purple line. So I'm just undoing that. If I wanted to do a perfectly even heighted line around my entire cube, I would have to cut that out manually, but I can also use Control R, loop cut and slide to do that for me. So I can go up and down, and it's very useful not only for making exact height cuts, not only in the middle, but also really at any point in your face. It should also be noted that it's much harder to use with more complex faces. So if you have an irregular face, a mesh that isn't symmetrical, it doesn't have normal faces like 20-sided faces or something, chances are it won't work, which is the main reason that the main reason that I do not use loop cut and slide. Oftentimes I will have objects that don't have all their sides, so if I cut this face out of my cube, it doesn't really work exactly the same, especially if the edges are connected to something else. So that's the main reason that I don't use it, but it is a very useful tool nonetheless if it is something that you need for a specific purpose. So that is loop cut and slide. Next is the knife tool. Knife is probably the one that I use the most often. I would say that it's the most useful out of all of these, and knife allows you to make incisions in your faces to create new faces. So the hotkey for knife is K, so if I press K, you'll notice you have this little, I can't tell, it's like a blade or a pencil or something, and a green dot as your cursor. And this is your knife, so if I just do something like that, well, that wasn't a very good example. If I do something like this, it will create a brand new face where previously I only had one. So that is what knife tool does, but the knife tool is really what allows you to start with a simple shape and transition into a very complex shape. So if I do this and I combine it with extruding, and then you can see that it's slowly getting more complex, and then I can just use really any tools I want, and you can start to see how such a simple shape can get into whatever you want it to be. And the knife tool is an extremely helpful tool with that. One thing that I should mention about the knife tool is that it almost always has to start at the edge. So if you near an edge of a face with your cursor, it will snap onto that edge, and you can click there and move your knife around. I would say that do not hold your click down as you are moving it around, because that does, if you're holding it down, it creates a knife cut wherever it can. So as soon as it crosses something that it can cut, it will cut if you're holding your mouse button down. So it's not very good, and it's much more precise to use the normal click and drag knife clicks. So knifing is very useful, and you can knife into your own knife cuts. So I can go through my previous cut, and as you can see here, it does cross, and it does work. All the faces are exactly what I wanted them to be. But it's worth noting that if you try to create a face that is not connected to the edge, Blender will automatically connect the face to the edge. And you also cannot merge these faces, and you cannot delete these edges at all. So these edges are permanent, and unless you create an edge yourself that takes their place, they will be there. So that is a limitation of the knife, but unless you're trying to cut down on the amount of faces you have, it doesn't really matter too much. So again, at the bottom of the screen here, you can see all the things that you can do with the knife. So if I click down and I press shift, it no longer snaps to the edges. So I can make much more precise cuts. So if I wanted to make a cut right here that is not quite touching the edge but almost there, I can do that. Whereas if I try to do that, if I try to do that with the snap on, I can't, because it snaps straight to that edge. So that is a useful variation of the knife tool. There is also C. If you press C while you are using your knife, you'll see this white line appear, and that constricts your knife cut to a 45-degree angle. So I cannot cut anything but a 45-degree angle, and that is extremely useful when you're trying to cut out, say, man-made things. There's not many man-made things that are not 90-degree angles. So say a window or a door in a wall, you'll want to use the C extension of the knife tool in order to make that. So that is very useful. One problem with using the C knife tool is that it's a straight line relative to your camera position, not relative to the face. So if I start cutting and I press C, it is a straight line, but it's not a straight line relative to the face. It's a straight line relative to my view. So it says this is a straight line, but if I focus it on the face, it's obviously not. So you can use your camera keys to do that more easily. So if I press 7, it gives me a top-down view, and I can do C knife cuts very easily in perfectly straight patterns. And if I move my camera, you can see that it is a perfectly straight line on the face itself. But say I move this edge outward a bit, I can't use a camera key to make that face align with my view. None of my camera keys will go directly into a way that makes the face parallel with my view. So the thing that you can do for this is Shift 7. You may remember 7 is the camera key that does vertical view, but Shift 7 locks the camera parallel to whatever face you have. So now if I do knife C, my straight knife cuts will again be straight knife cuts. And Shift C is a somewhat, or I'm sorry, Shift 7 is a somewhat obscure hotkey, but it is, it does a lot of uses with making straight knife cuts. If you're trying to make 90-degree angles, but at an angle to a certain axis, it is super, super helpful to have that Shift C. And I wish I knew Shift C as soon as I started, because I used to spend a very long time manually trying to parallel my camera with every face I had to cut, and it's a very big relief to not have to do that. So Shift C is very, very useful. Just revert my cube back to normal. So the next thing is the next thing is the rotate tool. So that is spin. So rotate does exactly what you think it would do. It just rotates whatever you're holding. But just like the move tool, it again is, you can't do 3D rotating on a 2D plane. So whatever way I look at this, it'll rotate differently. So just like grabbing and extruding and scaling and really every single tool over here, you can lock that to an axis. So R is the hotkey to rotate. So it's going all over the place, but I can lock it to a specific axis and rotate in the exact way that I want to rotate. It does the same thing for all axes, and it's extremely hard to get the right rotation that you want without using or without locking things to the axes. So I could do it like that, but it will always be a little bit off, since freehanding the camera perfectly on the face, you'll never get exactly what you want. So locking it to the axis is extremely important. So that is pretty much all of these tools here. The only ones we have left are the history tools and remove doubles, and those are very minor ones. They're very simple. History is just undo and redo, which is, so undo, redo, undo, redo. It's pretty much the same thing as any program that has undo and redo. The hotkey, as always, for undo is Control Z, just like, you know, a Word document or something like that. And remove doubles is somewhat of an obscure tool. Honestly, I don't use remove doubles very often. What remove doubles does is, if you have 2 points that are on the exact same coordinates, you know, down to the thousandth of decimal place, it will remove those points and make sure that nothing is overlapping. So if this point was on the exact same coordinate as this point, there would be a lot of face arguing, and your mesh would be overlapping faces. So the remove doubles tool, there's not really anything to explain about it. That's pretty much all it does, but I would click it like every hour or so if you're working on something, just to make sure that you don't have any doubled vertices. So it says right here on the top if you have any doubles. And something you can also do with remove doubles is you can increase the merge distance. So if I make my cube a bit like this, if I go here and say my merge distance is 1, I can remove doubles, and that's not big enough. 2. My removed doubles will now be in a 2 unit range around each point. So if this point is 2 units away from this point, then they will be merged. So usually I believe it's something like 0.00001, so that only things exactly on top of each other will be merged. But there are extremely niche cases where I have found the merge doubles tool useful in merging things that are a bit farther apart. So it's not super useful. There's no need to memorize it or anything, but just so you know it's there, it is something that you can utilize to make what you're trying to make. So next is the delete functions and really some other complex hotkeys. So I'm going to close out this Blender file and go to another one here that I will use as my example. So this is my Super Mario Sunshine custom level that I'm working on right now as I'm making this video. So I'll just go into the default view and we'll get into moving things around in somewhat of a more complex mesh. So with that square, it's obviously a lot different than this whole thing here. So if I move a point, it affects a lot more faces than it would in my example cube. And I feel like this is a much better area to show some of the more complex mesh functions. So a very useful tool is the X key is delete, and delete is really just deleting things. So if I delete this vertice right here, it deletes the vertice. A useful thing to know about the delete tool is that if you delete something, it will delete everything that is dependent on. So this face right here is dependent on this vertice to exist. If this vertice didn't exist, then this face could not exist either. So if you delete this vertice, that face will also disappear. Or that's weird. For some reason it did that, but that face will disappear. Oh, I know why I did that. So if you delete that, yeah, the face will disappear. I accidentally clicked another key. So that is important to note when using the delete function. So deleting vertices is a lot more dangerous than deleting faces or edges, because if I delete a vertice and I'm not thinking about it, I could just delete a whole section of faces. Like something like this that's connected to a lot of faces can really cause you some big problems. So deleting vertices isn't something I do very often, but edges do the same thing. So all the faces that have this edge as part of them, that depend on this edge to exist, will be deleted if I delete this edge here. And deleting faces is extremely simple. When you delete a face, there is no other face that is dependent on that face to exist. So if I delete this face, that edge here is part of that face, but I'm only deleting the face of it, not the edges of it. So you can individually delete faces and have nothing to fear. You won't accidentally delete any faces next to it. But the other very useful things in the X menu, as I'll call it, is the dissolve functions. So dissolve works differently than delete does. It is not the same thing. So if I just focus in on this one face here and I make a cut across it and I delete the cut and I go back to vertice select, I now have a vertice there in the middle of that edge that doesn't really do anything. There's not really any reason for this vertice to be here other than just kind of getting in my way. So the way you can get rid of that is you can dissolve the vertice. So if I click dissolve vertice, it just disappears. What dissolving the vertice does is it gets rid of the vertice and it figures out another way to create the same effect that that vertice had. So in this case, when the vertice isn't actually connected to anything, you can just delete it without deleting anything next to it, which is mainly what I use it for. But if I dissolve this vertice, you can see that when I dissolve it, the surrounding mesh will contort into a way that will connect it the way it had been before I dissolved it, just without using that vertice. And if you do that with a complex shape, it obviously doesn't really work. A very useful thing to note is that you sometimes get, I don't know what to call it, sort of glitchy face like this. And if I select it, you can see that this whole surface is that face, but this whole surface is that face, but it also doesn't have an edge here. So faces like this are extremely weird, and they're almost impossible to work with. You can accidentally do this. I've had numerous times where I somehow end up with a glitchy face like this, and I don't even know how I did it. So how to get rid of these as they occasionally sprout up in your work is you can just delete the face as normal, or you can triangulate it. So that is how you can get rid of something like that. So triangulating something is Control T, and it's whatever face you have selected, triangulating will convert that face into all triangles. So this face is not triangles. If I Control T, now it's all triangles. And if you're trying to import your map into anything, as this tutorial's purpose is, all games, with some few exceptions, they regard everything in triangles. So even if this isn't a triangle, once you export it in a format that a game will read, it will be triangulated automatically. So you don't have to triangulate everything manually when you export it, but triangulating is also a very useful shortcut. Something that I should mention of triangulating is that it's useful for making curves. So this is something that I used triangulation for. Making this curve between the two flat beaches would be almost impossible. I mean, I could do it, but it would take an extremely long time. So if I just select all these faces and delete them, I would have to create individual edges over here, and then I would have to mess with those, and it would be very hard. But I can also select all of these edges, or I'm sorry, all of these vertices next to the face, or next to the area that I want to fill, and I can press F, which I haven't gotten to yet, but F is the hotkey to create a face. So I can press F and it'll give me one of these glitchy faces here. But if I triangulate it, it automatically gives me a smoother variation of that face, which is very simple and easy to use. So that is triangulation. I got a bit off topic there, but next in the delete menu, which again is X, you will see dissolve edges and dissolve faces. So dissolve edges isn't really super useful. It does pretty much the exact same thing as dissolve faces. So I really never use dissolve edges, but dissolve faces, what it does is if I click this and I click this and I select multiple faces, if I press X and go into dissolve faces, it will make that face one big face. So that's very useful, like say I triangulate this or something and I don't want to have to cut through this jumble of edges here, so what I can do is I could just make this one face, and it's very simple again. And the hotkey for dissolving faces is F, which is the same thing as making faces. So that is pretty much the X menu, the delete menu. So next I will talk about F. So I'll go back into I'll go back into my little example page. So I will start off by modifying this cube a bit for this example. So let's say I have this cube and I want to make it a full cube again. I don't want these holes here. So what F does is it makes something between what you have selected. So if I'm in vertice select and I select this and I select this and I press F, it will make an edge between those two vertices. If I'm in edge select and I press this and this and this and I press F, it it will make a face between those two edges. And if I select this edge and I press F, it will create a face between what I've selected. So F is the face tool, and it is also the dissolve faces tool. So F is used for more than one thing, but all of them tied into faces. So F is very useful when you're doing simplistic shapes like this cube. You don't really have to calculate where everything goes. You already know that all of these other faces are flat and 90 degrees, so you can just use F to create simple faces. And that is the creating faces tool. Another useful menu is the W menu. W is, I don't use W very much, but it can be useful for select things in here. So W is the specials menu, and again, none of these are very super useful when modeling things, but I do use, merge. So merge is useful for, creating slopes in your faces. So if I do W and then I do merge, also you'll notice that some of these options have an underline below them. So what that underline means is, so for this, the P is underlined, so if I press P on the keyboard, that will be clicked. So merge is M, so if I press W for the specials tab and then M, it will bring up the merge tab. So merge is a kind of obscure function. I don't use it a ton, but I do use it to make sort of pyramid shapes like that. Those are kind of difficult to make without merge. So that is another useful feature. The next thing is the viewport shading menu. So for this, I'll go back into my other creation here. So viewport shading is what you see in the viewport. So what I'm looking at right now is the materials type of viewport. So material is what I'm currently on now. Blender will automatically be in a solid form. That's why the cube is gray. Everything's gray and solid. So solid is only the physical things that you have modeled. So it's just pretty easy. Wireframe is very useful. Wireframe, the hotkey for that is Z. So I press Z, it goes to a wireframe view, and this can be useful for if you're trying to do something in a tight space like this little thing here, or if I'm trying to cut something up here but I can't directly see it. That is an occasion where wireframe would be very useful. There's also texture, which I don't really use very much for the sake of SMS maps. It's not very useful, so I won't really talk about it. I usually keep everything in material, which is the textures applied to your faces. So material, and the last one is rendered. And rendered, as you can see, calculates all the light patterns and all the faces, and it gives you the rendered version of your model. So this is the most high quality image that you'll get of your model once you wait for the rendering to finish here. But if you want to view your model without all these black lines here, you can go back into object mode, which is another way to do it. So it's very easy to view without the black lines, without rendering. I used to do rendering all the time when I wanted to do that, and it's very slow. It's very annoying to do with all the pixely movements. So that is a rendering, and I don't really use that very often. So if I go back into edit mode here, the next thing I wanted to go over is text. So text, again, is a somewhat, I don't know, obscure thing, but I figured I'd put it in here anyways. So text is pretty much what you'd think. It is three-dimensional text. So the way you add text is add here and then text, and that's going to be your text. Once you go into edit mode of that text object, you can type whatever you want. So that can be my type, and I can go back into object mode and I can move that all around, and I can I can stand that up and I can put it in my mesh. But if you're using text, which I do sometimes, it's important to note that this is not a mesh. So if I go into edit mode, I cannot edit any points on this because it's not a mesh, it is text. And the way that you create a mesh from a text is a kind of convoluted hotkey. It is there it is, it's Alt-C. So Alt-C is convert to, and you can do Alt-C mesh, and then after that your text will now be movable and you can move everything around. So I do use that sometimes, not necessarily all the time when I'm making custom levels, but that is very useful, and you can maneuver it around just like you would any sort of mesh. You can extrude it and things like that. So that's another thing extruding is useful for. If you have a plane, you can make that as thick or as thin as you want. So text to mesh is somewhat useful if you want to put some writing in your game. There's not really any textures in SMS that are readable, so I'll delete that. Now I'm going to get into some of the more obscure things. That is the majority of the modeling section. So with what you know now, if you are able to write down all those hotkeys and get all that stuff memorized, that is really all you need to make something really cool. And that's pretty much it. I could end this tutorial here, and you could really make whatever you want. It's important to know that even though you know everything that you need to know so far, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that you make from here on out is going to be great. Creating things in Blender is somewhat of a thing that you have to practice. So if your first creation doesn't look very good, don't worry. My creation didn't look very good either. So actually, I'll X this out and let's see here. There it is. So this is my first creation in Blender. It is very bad. All of these shapes were created manually. I manually created every one of these points. None of these faces are remotely connected. Everything is a simple plane. I made this window by specifically creating a face with a hole in it, not by cutting it out. So this is my first creation, and it's really not very good at all. So it does take a while to become good at it, but I can guarantee that if you keep going at it, it will eventually become easier as you really get to know the primitive shapes and the hotkeys, etc. It will definitely become easier to make stuff. Like, let's see here, my second Blender creation was this house, and as you can see, it's marginally better than the previous one. So, as you go on, you just get better and better. So this was my next one, like maybe a week after I did the previous one. So it's very easy to get discouraged when learning Blender. That's why I show those. But Blender is such an amazing tool to be good at. It's useful for way more things than I originally thought it would be useful for. So it is extremely fun to do once you're good at it, and you don't have to think about the hotkeys. You don't have to think about what functions mean doing what. So you can really build whatever you want, and that's pretty much the reason why I like 3D modeling. So that's my little motivational pep talk for you. So after that, I guess we'll get into the somewhat more complicated things about Blender. So one thing that kind of annoys me about this software is that there are so many things that you can do that the hotkeys, there's more than 26, there's more than however many keys you have on your keyboard. So you have absolutely crazy hotkeys like Control Shift Alt C. So that's kind of the thing we're going to be going over now, and it's kind of hard to remember. That's probably the hotkeys that I would stay away from unless I had to. So now we're going to get into those and the specifics of using each of these tools here. So now that we know the rest of the tools, we can now go into a bit more depth into the tools that we've already learned and figure out some pretty cool things about them. So I will load up my other file for this again, since we're doing some more complex-ish stuff. Alright, so the first thing to go over, well, I guess I didn't really need to go into this file for this, but the first thing to go over is the center of gravity of your object. Oops. The center of gravity of your object. So it's not doing it right now. I believe there's a hotkey to do it. There's so many hotkeys in Blender that you can't possibly know all of them. So really a lot of things that I've learned that have made this easier was to fix mistakes that I accidentally made by accidentally pressing a hotkey of some sort. So basically, if you move something around a lot, if you size it up a lot, so right now, as you can see, if I rotate this cube, it is currently rotating around my cursor, and that is not good. If I need to rotate this cube at all, it moves all over the place and I lose track of it, and it's terrible. So when that happens, which inevitably it probably will, since it happened to me so many times while learning this, you can press Control Shift Alt C, and it will give you Set Origin. So Set Origin to Center of Mass will redo your pivot point. Can't be done in edit mode, sorry. So it will redo your pivot point, and now your cube will rotate around itself like it usually will. So that is one of the very useful tools that I have learned and wished that I had knew when I started. I don't believe that I went over focusing in on different things. So let's say I want to go to this point way over here. If you're moving the camera around like usual, you can't really get there. You have to move it like this. And if I wanted to view this point from over here, you can't really do that. So Blender has actually a very good camera system. So how you focus onto a selected part of your mesh is the period key on your number pad. If you do not have a number pad, if you're working on a laptop, or if you're working on whatever doesn't have a number pad, there will be some settings that you have to change to make all your hotkeys the same. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the video. It's much harder to do on a laptop, but so period on your number pad focuses in, and another useful camera control is shift scroll. So when you shift scroll, you lock the camera at whatever you are pointed at, and you can only move the camera up and down. So you can scroll out normally, and you can also scroll like this. So it makes it much easier to do things so that you don't have to focus in on something every single time you want to look at a specific part of your mesh. So again, shift and scroll moves it up and down relative to the camera, and scrolling normally goes in and out. Another useful camera control is shift, middle mouse button click, and then just dragging around. So normally if you drag around with your middle mouse, it just drags around the camera like normal, but if you hold shift and do that, you can do it and it will not mess up the direction that you're looking at with the camera. It'll only move the camera on the planes that it is currently facing. So those are some other camera controls. That's why that you would probably need to write things down, because it does get kind of complicated. More useful camera controls, there's a lot of them. As I said before, Shift 7 makes your camera parallel to the face, but let me see if I can... So it's not doing it right now, but sometimes when you press Shift 7, like, let me just get back into... So sometimes if you press Shift 7, it'll look at the face from out here, but sometimes it'll also look at the face from in here. So if you ever want to do the reverse of a camera action, you can do Control and then that camera action. So 7 on your number pad is the hotkey to view the scene vertically, and if you hit Control 7, you will view it vertically from the opposite side. So if I hit Control Shift 7, it will now view the face parallel to the camera on the other side of the face. So that is another useful camera tip. I can't help but think there's something I'm missing here. I'm not really doing this off of a script, so I feel like I am missing something, but I'll come back to it if I think of it. So I guess we'll mess around with the tools in a more complex way here. So as I said before, extruding is the first one we did, and we can go into that a bit more in depth now. So extruding, you know, exactly what I mentioned before, but when extruding, you can also extrude. I'll get a fresh file for this. When you extrude, you can make rounded edges. So I'll do this with a circle. I'll create a face there, and let's say I want to make a vase, and you know I can extrude my circle, but I can't really make it rounded on all sides. So one of the things that's very useful is if you extrude, and then with this face selected, you scale. And that is a useful shortcut you can use to make rounded objects, and you can slowly build that up until you have a rounded shape that you like. So, you know, something like that. And now you have a perfectly round shape. And you'll also notice that I don't really have to think about what I'm doing in Blender very much anymore, and that is the point that you'll ideally want to get to. So, you know, before you get to that point, you're really thinking of, okay, now I need to do this, now I need to do this, but the point at which you can really go into Blender and create exactly what you want to, and it's just a free roam environment, is when, you know, you don't really have to think about too much what you're doing. So again, memorize the hotkeys, it's very useful. So just all the camera controls, I can do those pretty well. And so, again, just don't be discouraged if you can't do things off the bat. It's taken me a year and a half to be this good, and there's still people that are miles and miles and miles ahead of me. So, yeah, that's extruding, I guess. So, next is inset faces. Inset faces doesn't have too many complex things going on with it. So, just get a cube in here. Where's my cube? That's all the way over there. Okay. I don't know why it came in over there, but I'll focus up on it, and we'll do inset faces. So inset faces, it should be noted with inset faces that if your faces are all connected, so if I go back to face select and I select all these faces, I can inset faces and it'll do it on the edge of all those faces, but if I select all these faces, then there is no edge to what I have selected. So if I press I and try to inset a face, it won't do anything since there is no edge to inset a face on. Well, yeah, as I said before, when you use a hotkey, you will be greeted by all this stuff down here: thickness, depth, tweak. I don't know what any of those mean. It's kind of the magic of Blender. No matter how good you get, there's always something that is more advanced than what you know. There's always something new to learn. So one very, very, very useful tool that I'll introduce you to is the Blender manual. So if I go on Google here, and I'll just search up Blender manual. If you ever want to learn how to do something, Blender does have an official searchable manual. You can download it, you can search it. So if I do inset faces, it gives you a much, much more in-depth explanation, far past anything that I really could ever tell you. So, and in here you will see, where's my Blender window? You will see all of the stuff down here, depth. What does that mean? You can go to your Blender manual and depth. Raise or lower the newly inset faces to add depth. So, yeah, so you can do that. And what is it? Control. And there you go. There's an easy way to bevel. So no matter what you know about something, there's usually a way that you could do it faster. So it's very useful taking a look at the Blender manual. The only thing that is wrong with it, using the Blender manual that is doing something very obscure. So I don't know if I'll find it. I'm just clicking through right here. I'm not really looking for anything. But occasionally you'll get into a section of the Blender manual and all it says is to do. I've had that a lot of times, and I'll be searching about how to do something, and I'll get to the Blender manual page, and it says exactly what I want, and it's not even there. So the Blender manual, I believe, is open source, so anybody can edit it. So by that logic, less people know about the more obscure things, and therefore there's less people to write the manual. So just with that, just know that there's not everything on there, but if you're just starting out or if you're just doing all these tools, then it's definitely on there. You have to get pretty complex to try to get something that's not finished on the Blender manual. So next is subdivide, as we talked about before. There's not really anything too complex that's subdivide, or that I can even talk about with subdivide. But I will show you what it's like to subdivide a triangle. So something that is, again, very useful with your primitives. I probably should have talked about this earlier, but when you're using primitives, you will notice that this menu here exists, and what you can do is you can change the amount of vertices that it has, so you can make whatever shape you want, and you'll notice if you get down to it, you can create a perfectly equilateral triangle pyramid, or you can create a cone with a bigger surface on it. And this works with all shapes. Like if you want, where is it? Here it is. So if you want a torus that has like no segments, you could make something like this, and you could have even more possibilities of something that you could start off your complex mesh with. So just do that really quick. But what was I talking about? Triangles. So the easiest way to add a triangle is to create a plane and cut it in half. Oops. So if I go over and subdivide this triangle, it will go into triangles. So the number of triangles within your subdivided face is not the edges of the face. The what's the word I'm looking for? The sides. The edges of the inset face will always be equal to the edges of the outset face. And with that, every subdivided face will be equal to each other, so all of these faces are the exact same size. So if you make a square, it's going to be squares. If you make a triangle, it's going to be triangles, etc., etc. So that is pretty much it with faces. So most of these other tools don't have super in-depth complex stuff, but there is still more that I can show you. I'm trying not to get too obscure here unnecessarily. Keep it relatively simple-ish. So a very useful thing that I haven't really seen too many tutorials about, and it's very hard to see a tutorial about it if you don't know what it's called. So say I want this to be my wall, and I want a cylindrical hole in the wall. I want there to be a tunnel in this wall. That is extremely hard to do, so I'd have to cut a circle. I've had to make sure that everything is the same here as it is on this opposite side. I have to make sure all the edges are exactly the same at the coordinates, and then I have to make each individual face myself, making sure everything is going right. But there is really a much easier way. And this is another one of those things that I wish that I knew before I started this. Oops. So you can create a shape that will be the whole of a shape. So I want a tunnel through this cube. You can go into this modifier section. These you won't really use a ton if you're just modeling stuff, but this wrench here is the modifiers section, and you can add modifiers. There's a big intimidating list here. I have absolutely no idea what 90% of these mean, but Boolean is the one we're going to be looking at, and Boolean is, in my opinion, the most useful of all of these. So to start out, you have to have your whole object and your, I don't know, tunnel object, whatever it's called, in different objects. So the way, say I have this cylinder in the same object as I have this cube, I can select that cylinder and I can press P, and that can separate my object. So this cylinder is now a different object than this cube is. And if I wanted to make these two the same object again, I could press Control J. Just getting into some of the more obscure hotkeys here. So I can apply the Boolean modifier right here, Boolean modifier to my cube, and it'll give you this menu, and you have to select the object that you want it to interact with. So in my case, it's this is called circle, so circle. I'll select circle, and now it gives you a preview of what's going to happen once you click apply. So intersect There's union, which puts both of them together, and there's also difference. So I will apply the difference modifier, and there you go. There's a tunnel in my cube, and I can go ahead and delete this, and I now have a cube that has a tunnel in it. So again, this would probably take me an hour and a half to do without the Boolean modifier. So most of the modifiers don't really do too much in strictly modeling, but the Boolean one is very useful. Let me go back to my other one here. So another thing is selecting. So I've already talked about shift selecting, but if I go into Z here, the wireframe hotkey, let's say I wanted to, I'll use this pillar out here as an example. Let's say I wanted to select all of the vertices on this pillar. Now, that is going to take a long time, just shift clicking all of these. So there's multiple ways to select things, and they are C, B, and Control. C will give you this circle here, and you can widen and lessen this circle with the scroll wheel on your mouse. And you can scroll over everything, and it will select everything that it is around. So there's that. There's also the B, which is box. You can drag a box and select everything in the box. You can use wireframe with the box select, and it will select everything even through what you're looking at, which is very useful. And the last but not least is the control select. I'll go into a new file for this. So control select. Control select's pretty useful if you're trying to, I don't know, select every square in this row of squares here. You could do camera angle 7 and, I don't know, C and go around all of them, but it's kind of hard to do only the faces you want. So control, if you have a face selected and hold control, it will select the most efficient path to the face that you click next. So it is super useful for selecting a lot of faces at the same time, but also you have to be careful about what you control select, because if I do this, it's going to go through the middle instead of the outside, because that is the more efficient path to go. So you can just do a few control selects instead of a million individual face selects. Another thing is controlling the coordinates of points manually. So you'll notice that there is this menu and that it exists. So to get this menu on your screen, you press N. So N gets it on and off your screen. This menu is, I don't really use all of this stuff very much, but I do use this here. So the N menu will give you the exact location of every vertex that you select. So if I select here, this is at 12.3, 30.4, negative 2.2. So if you're dealing with a complex object, you can use this to manually put your points exactly where you want them. And tools over here are often the way to go, but if you're doing, I don't have an example, but if you need to for whatever reason, you can manually control your points. So that is another very useful feature. Something that you can also do that is a bit more complex, and that also works with pretty much every tool, is typing in manual numbers after your hotkey is entered. So if I extrude this face, and well, actually this would be a better example. Let's say I want this face to be just as extruded as this face, exactly as extruded as each other. So I could extrude that, and I could eyeball, and I could go, that's pretty similar, but you can do E hotkey for extrude, and then type the amount that you want it to be extruded by. So let's say I want this wall to be 1 unit extruded. So I can type 1, and that will be exactly 1 unit extruded. E1, exactly 1 unit extruded. And I can do that for really anything I want. And that also works for moving things. So G1, that moves it in that direction. And S1 doesn't change it, but S2 makes it twice as big. And see, it's messed up because my center of mass, as we talked about before, isn't on the face. But so that's very useful for moving things around. Sorry about that. So the next thing that I'm going to go into, we've kind of done everything that we can with modeling. After this, you pretty much know everything I know. So that's pretty much it. But next we're going to talk about rendering. So rendering is making an image of whatever you want. So rendering is very useful. Let's say, I don't know, you want to have a promo picture for whatever you're making. I don't know. In the context of making a custom level, rendering is the way you want to take that picture. So rendering is very easy. It's not really too hard. It's pretty simple. So there's 2 ways to do it. Up here is Blender render, Cycles render, and Blender game render. So we're pretty much going to only be using Blender render and Cycles render. So I will create a new Blender document to show you this. And here is my cube. So what you need to render something, if I render right now, you need a light source to render by. So every Blender starts with this lamp here. I'm going to delete that. The way you create light sources is while you are in object mode, you can go over here and you can create a light source. There's a spotlight, which does exactly what you'd think it would do. Spotlight. There's a sun, which does again exactly as you would think it would do. A point light, which gives off a very specific ray of light from the exact point that it exists on. It's not as bright, and I believe it casts down exactly, if I remember correctly. But Hemi is a very useful one. It's very useful for looking at the textures of your faces if you've gotten that far. Hemi is pretty much just imagine a giant light in a hemisphere above your object, so every face but the bottom will be lighted, and you can hit render and it will be rendered. So the things that you'll have to worry about when you're rendering is your camera. So this is your camera, and if you press 0, you can see from your camera's point of view. So if I move my camera all the way back here, I can view this little corner. So if I click the render button, I can see this little corner. By the way you get out of this menu, like, you press escape. Took me a while to learn that. But anyways, you can move your camera like you would move anything. So on your axes, go to 0. You can see that. I want to get this a little bit more centered in my camera view, so I keep doing it. Maybe go up a little bit, and maybe a bit more on the x-axis. Maybe I should move it out a bit. That's pretty good. And you really just have to mess with it a bit. and render, and it shows you what you have. Another useful tool for moving your camera is Control-Alt-0. So Control-Alt-0 is if I move my viewpoint to whatever, Control-Alt-0 snaps the camera to your viewpoint, so that can save you a bit of time in trying out to find where the camera is. So that's it for setting up the render, but when you render something and you want to save the image, you also have to come over here to the render presets. This is the resolution, obviously. This is the pixel count of each way of your picture. So Y is this and X is this, or other way around, sorry. But this slider right here, you can drag it back and forth, and it starts at 50%. So if you hit render while this is at 50%, your render will be half the size of this. 100%, it will be full size of this. As you can see, it's a bit bigger. And I don't know, 15%, 6%, you know, it's pretty intuitive, but that is something important that you want to know, so you're not rendering at 4K to get a 1080p picture. The next thing to render is where you'd like your file to be saved to. So the way you do that is you click this file icon and go to wherever you'd like to save it, and then it will do that for you. And once you render, you can hit F3, and then it will automatically bring up the option to save your image. It should also be noted that at any time you can press space, and it will bring up a searchable directory of every single function in the entirety of Blender. So if I forget the hotkey of extrude, I can extrude. It doesn't work for that, sorry. But it works for a lot of things. So if I want to pack my file, if I want to really do anything, snap my knife, you can really search up anything that you want to, and it'll come up there. Add a keyframe. So that is about it with rendering. I won't really use that too much if you're making a custom SMS level. Next I would go into texturing, but I have a separate video on texturing that I'm already satisfied with, so I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video so you can go check that out. And that is how you go from your solid view to you know, all of the colorful textures that you'd like, and it really makes your level pop. So that is about it for this Blender tutorial. I hope that I've covered you know, enough to get you going. I've definitely covered pretty much everything that I can think of. If I think of anything else, I'll make another video of this. I'll put an update in the description. So I hope this helped you. I've seen a lot of people get discouraged from joining the SMS ROM hacking community, or modding community, or whatever you want to call it, because they're scared of learning Blender. So I hope this educated you in the fact that it's pretty simple. It's mathematical. So yeah, that's about it. I hope that you learned something. I'm not very good at outros. Thanks for watching.